All right, so I'm going to get a little bit more philosophical on you guys today. So I know it's been kind of a church history thing, and this is certainly that. But I'm going to explain a certain particular philosophical view that really impacts a great deal of what we've seen in the last 150 years of culture, and also what's occurring, has occurred, and is occurring in the church even today, okay? And so that has to do with the term postmodernism. Who's heard that term? It's been around long enough for people to be at least familiar with the word. The term postmodernism first occurred in architecture. And so it's a term that's used in different areas of understanding and study. And so there's an architectural viewpoint, architectural fad, if you will, called modernism. And then what came after that, they called postmodernism. And so the term can have some difficulty even in that, like, well, what comes after postmodernism? Is postmodernism, you just, so sometimes the terminology gets confusing. But I'm going to talk about postmodernism in terms of what's called epistemology. So epistemology is essentially the study of how we know things. How do we come to an understanding of the knowledge we possess? Epistemology is that kind of study of how do I come to think? How do people think today? Where does that come from? How do I come to understand things? What things are being promoted in a society are based on the ways that people think. And so epistemology is that study, the study of the way people think. And so I'm going to talk about postmodernism in terms of that. And so in order to do that, I just want to back us up a little bit and talk pre-modern thought. So this is before 1600, okay? Pre-modern thought saw truth and knowledge as coming as a subset of God. God exists, so pre-modern thought assumed God existed. Okay, there was that assumption amongst society at large, okay, that God existed and that God knows everything. And therefore, the things that we know, the things that we learn, are a subset of God's perfect knowledge, of God's comprehensive knowledge. And so God has exhaustive knowledge of all things. We know things in part. We grow in our knowledge. God does not. So everything that humanity knows is a subset of God and even dependent upon God, depending on who you were. Christians certainly would argue that our knowledge is dependent upon God's grace and mercy, that He is the one who reveals truth. And therefore we are dependent on His graciousness to us in order for us to understand any truth. That's what Christians would say. But pre-modernism, at least in general, recognized that all truth was a subset of God's understanding of knowledge and what God knows. But then with the Enlightenment comes modernism. Okay, and the one that many think kicked this different philosophical viewpoint off was René Descartes. Okay. All first-year philosophy and even psychology students hear of René Descartes. Cognito ergo sum, right? I think, therefore I am. Okay, that's René Descartes. I think, therefore I am. And so where do we see René Descartes changing the source of knowledge and truth?
I think, therefore I am.
Yeah. It's no longer, coming from God. Now, knowledge begins with the finite knower, me. I can prove my existence because I'm thinking. If I'm thinking, that says I exist, right? And so there's that assumption there, and René Descartes changed that, and it became known as philosophical modernism, okay? And so it snowballed from there. Now René Descartes was a devout Roman Catholic, and he extrapolated from that truth of, I think, therefore I am. He extrapolated from that, he got all the way to Roman Catholicism. He wrote volumes on it. Think geometric proofs, okay? That's the kind of stuff he was doing in his thinking. And so, so he's called kind of the father of this foundationalist epistemology or modernism. And so these are the 6 tenets of modernistic thought, okay? So the first, knowledge begins with a finite individual, begins with me. Now, no longer does knowledge and truth begin with God, and then we receive that truth from him. Now it can start with me. Knowledge, truth, they can all start with me. I'm the knower. I am the learner. I am the one who exists and is able to discover these things for myself. So knowledge begins with me. Number 2, knowledge or truth is both desirable and attainable. Okay? So you can find truth. You can come to an understanding of true things, true knowledge, and you can achieve that. That is achievable. That's attainable. And because it's achievable and attainable, it's desirable. You want that. You want to get that. You want that knowledge. You want that true truth. Modernism is incredibly foundationalist, meaning you find those foundational truths and then you build up from there. Okay? If you're thinking science class, we're going together, right? You learn the periodic table. Then you move from there, right? You find out how they connect together. You find out that water is made up of, right, 2 H's and 1 O, right? And so again, you're growing in your knowledge of these things. Okay, so that's modernistic thought. It's very foundational. It's also very methodical. Okay, if you want to find something out, you just have to have the right steps in place. You feed in the data, you turn the crank, and out comes truth. Okay? Very much modernistic thinking. So scientific method, mathematics, right? All these things just blossomed during the Enlightenment. Okay? Our understanding of science, our understanding of so many things just exploded during the Enlightenment. And a lot of that becomes part of that scientific method. And so there's this methodical format to understanding truth, understanding and attaining knowledge. Okay, 5. There's this pursuit for ahistorical universal truth. If water is 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen here in Indiana, it's also true in China. It's also true in France. It's also true in Japan. It's true everywhere. Truth is ahistorical, universal. It doesn't matter whether you're in 1600, 1000, if you're 2000 BC. Water is 2 hydrogens, 1 oxygen. It's ahistorical, universal. It's true here, there, everywhere, and all time. Okay, that's what truth is. It's ahistorical and universal. That's a product of modernistic thought. 6, and lastly, there's a rising commitment to philosophical naturalism. That is just, what that means is people were finding more and more naturalistic reasons to explain things. You know, we might think that pre-modernism really had everything going for it, right? They saw truth as coming from God, but it was also incredibly superstitious, right? You know, so they would see certain patterns in the stars, and they would align their lives with those things, knowing that God existed, knowing that truth came from him, and yet that so much of their life and regular pattern of life was very incredibly superstitious. And so modernism said, no, that, you know, there's a natural explanation for these things, right? Orbits and the cosmos and what we can determine by math. And you've got Euclid and you've got Copernicus, and no longer is the Earth considered flat. No longer is the Earth the thing that the sun revolves around. Rather, we revolve around the sun, right? All this was revolutionary. Revolutionary, okay? And yet, what does that mean for Christianity? Philosophical naturalism. Well, that means that this book we say is the Word of God. Well, now it's a book that is a historical document. Yes, it's important. It has its place, but it's a book we can analyze and apply our tests to like any other book, like any other historical document. And so, while pre-modernism was very superstitious, modernism took out the supernatural completely. And now the supernatural is not needed. Supernatural just doesn't make sense. okay? When you've got this kind of way of thinking about things, okay, then, you don't need God at all, ultimately, at the end of the day. And that's what modernism did, and it led to a number of things. It started with deism. Kind of God exists, but he's off doing his own thing somewhere else. He got the world started, he started spinning it around, and then he just took off. He left us alone, and everything's understandable by natural explanations, okay? And so that's kind of what deism says. It's kind of trying to keep a hand in both realms. I want to keep God, but I want to keep my philosophical naturalism as well. So deism does that. What that cuts out, though, in the Bible is all the miracles, the resurrection, God coming to this earth in the person of Jesus Christ. That's all gone in philosophical naturalism and deism, okay? Secularism. Secularism was a result of of modernistic thought as well. And by secularism, I don't mean the absence of religion or the absence of an understanding of God. What I mean is you keep it on the periphery. Religion now and your relationship with God is just something kind of you add into your life, and it becomes a part of just the stuff you do, right? If your faith is just the thing you do on Sunday mornings, that's secular. If your faith and your religion is just something you can relegate to one of your hobbies that you're interested in and involved in, that's secular. Okay? So that is not biblical Christianity. That's something that the world can embrace. You know, I like how I feel when I go to church. They sing some nice songs. There's some really good friendships there. But the whole God and Jesus thing, it's just, I'm going to keep it off to the side. Okay? That's secularism. And then lastly, it's liberalism. This isn't political. Liberalism just says, essentially, I am the one who stands in judgment over the truth. I'm the one who determines it, and I read my Bible, and I go, I like this part, I think this is true. I don't like this part, I don't think this is true. And I'm the one who gets to say that, because knowledge begins with me. So I get to determine what I like and what I don't like. Classic example of modernistic thought is the Thomas Jefferson Bible, right? I joke and say that he just went through it with a Sharpie highlighter and just crossed out all the stuff he didn't like. You know what the things he crossed out? All the miracles. He just cut and pasted. You can still buy a Thomas Jefferson Bible today, and it's a prime example of modernistic thought. Get rid of all the miracles, get rid of all the supernatural, get rid of all these things that don't align with this way of thinking, and that's what you're left with, okay? And that's what liberalism did. And so Christianity, in many ways, reacted to this in different ways. A lot of books and materials came out, but I think I mentioned last week how fundamentalism in particular rose up in opposition to liberalism, because liberalism was getting into the churches, right? Liberalism was infiltrating every area of life because it's the way people thought. It's just the way everybody was thinking. That I am up here and I'm the one who determines the truth. I figure it out. So I look at things, what I like or don't like, that's what I get to pick and choose at. Fundamentalists said, no, we got to get back to the core of who we are. God is real. The scriptures are inerrant and the very word of God. And so the miracles are true and real and happened historically. So I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but that's really for much of the Christian response to modernism, that's kind of what it looked like. Fundamentalism, of course, got a bad reputation, rightly so in many degrees, in many areas. They became just incredibly argumentative about everything then. And unfortunately, they got a bad name. But at the start, fundamentalism was something very good, right? They just said we need to get back to the core of who we are and what we believe as Christians, and remember that. Okay. So now that brings us to postmodernism. Okay, which means this is the way of thinking that occurred after modernism. Okay, and in some ways, we're not even a postmodernistic society anymore, even today. Some of these things that they propose are just invalid even amongst scholars today. A lot of postmodernistic thought isn't really on the forefront anymore, and yet it has influenced so much of the world around us that this will be unmistakable. Okay, so history is messy, and so things change in certain times in certain ways amongst certain people groups. It's all different, and you're trying to put it in a line and just say happened this and this and this and then this and this. It just, history doesn't really work like that. And so I'm going to take you first to Germany. And the study of hermeneutics. Hermeneutics is the study of interpretation. You read something and you interpret what it means, okay? And so in Germany they said, well, if truth begins with the finite individual, I mean, what if I'm having a bad day? What if I'm having a fight with my spouse? What if, I drank too much coffee and I can't think straight? What if 100,000 other little things happen and I go to read a text, the Bible or whatever, I go to read the text and I misunderstand what is there? Well, that's understandable. I'm finite. I'm not God. I'm finite. And so I'm going to come to the text with all of my prejudices, presuppositions, all the things that make up me, and I'm going to come to the text and I'm going to interpret it my own way. I am not a Japanese woman living in the year 1200 AD. You take a Bible verse and pull it out and give it to people all different cultures, different societies, different ways of thinking, different time periods. They're going to read their Bibles differently. So go to Thailand, talk to a Buddhist. And there's actually a story. A missionary actually gives a Thai Buddhist a New Testament. And it speaks to that Buddhist a short time later and says, oh, what did you think? Were you able to read it? What did you think? And the Buddhist says, oh, yes, I read it. I loved it. I love that Jesus guy. I think I like him even more than Buddha. And the missionary's like, whoa, things are going pretty well here. Like, we're doing something right. So he said, well, what did you like about it? He says, well, you read the first chapter and Jesus comes to the earth and he dies and rises again. You come to the second chapter and he comes to the earth and he dies and he rises again. He does it 4 times, but after 4 times, Jesus becomes God. Where Buddha had to do it thousands of times. You see what the Buddha just misunderstood? He just read it chronologically and thought Jesus comes in Matthew, the book of Matthew. He lives and dies. Well, he comes again, but now it's in Mark. And then he does it again in Luke. And then he does it again in John. He didn't understand what he was reading. Okay? And do we take that into account? Different cultures, different ways of thinking, different societies. The Germans were. And so they said, this is what happens. Here's me. And I come to the text. That's a T for text. Okay? And I come at it at an angle. I don't come at straight on. And so modernism said, here's me. I come to the text, and then the truth comes right back at me. It's just perfectly linear. I go at the text, truth comes back. Okay? Germans said, no, I don't go straight at it. I kind of shoot at it at an angle. And then what happens is, I'm not quite perfect. I'm not perfect. And so I come at an angle at the text, and then the text actually changes me a little bit. No matter what that text might be, I'm now a little bit different from having read it. And so therefore, the text kind of changes me. And then I come again to the text, again at a slightly different angle, but still at an angle, and I come to the text, and then it comes back around. You see what we just made? A circle. It's not straight at the text, true straight back at me. Now it's what they call the hermeneutical circle. And where do you get truth in the hermeneutical circle? It's impossible. You can't. Truth is no longer desirable or attainable because I'm always going to be slightly different. I'm always going to read the text slightly different, and I'm going to be changed after that. I'm going to read the text today differently than I'm going to read the text tomorrow. You see what's happened? Truth is now no longer attainable or desirable.
Is it considered what you make it?
Kinda, yeah. Yeah. So if you hear live your truth, it's very postmodern. Yeah, very postmodern. And I'll get to some of that even. So my favorite way of seeing it is what happened in linguistics in France. And it happened largely in part by man named Ferdinand de Saussure. And he was a linguist. He never wrote down anything. But his students took voluminous notes and then published those notes later. And so this is what Saussure said. He said, take these letters right here, a T, an R, and 2 E's. You read that, you put those 3 or 4 letters together, and you get something in your mind, right? Well, what if I use a B and an O and a U and an N? That's incomprehensible to you, isn't it? Unless you speak German. And then you realize that means the same thing as that. Well, what about an A, an R, a B, an R, and an E? Well, that's just French for the exact same meaning. So that means when we put this T, R, E, E together, who determines what that means? The Germans don't determine that's what that means. Only English speakers do. And so now, meaning, truth, and knowledge is culturally agreed upon. That if I said the word schmuckelblocks, you would have no idea what that means unless we started right here in this room that we're going to change the word tree to smuckelblocks. And that thing that's outside in the grass growing up with all those big leaves and branches on it, we're all going to start calling it a schmuckelblocks, and it's going to catch on, and everywhere we'll change the dictionary. Because knowledge, truth, understanding is socially and culturally understood, recognized, and embraced, or rejected. And so if a society says, we don't want to call it tree anymore, we want to call it schmuckelblocks, a society can do that, can't they? That's a study. I mean, I haven't said anything yet that I think is biblically false or anything. I think all these things are true. And linguistics is a fascinating study. And if we wanted to cram some letters together or make some new letters, and we wanted to, as a culture, decide this is what we're going to do, you know what? Linguistics has to bow to us. But then do you say that that is true now for all truth? So this happened to a friend of mine. He went to Western Michigan University, took a comparative religions class. The professors are talking about Christianity, and then he says, but what about all the Hindus? Christians say all those people go to hell. That's not right. And my friend, as a result of that class, it really messed him up in the head, philosophically. And he quit going to church for a long time. And so if now knowledge is not ahistorical and universal, now it's cultural. Now it's up for debate. Now it's for whatever we decide truth is. And so really, it changed every one of these things except the first one. Post-modernism did. So post-modernism, it keeps me as the finite knower, but instead of having a very optimistic viewpoint of my abilities to understand truth and achieve truth, now it's very pessimistic. That's what postmodernism says. You really are not capable of that. And so instead of knowledge and truth being desirable and attainable, now it's neither. Instead of being foundationalist, now postmodernism is very anti-foundationalist. Yeah, very much so. Yeah, very much so. Instead of methodical, well, if I have my own method and you have your own method, well, how many methods now are there? There's as many methods as there are people, right? And so methodical is no longer valid. You can't just say this is the scientific process that you always use and you always apply to these things and this is the way you always get truth. Now you can't say that anymore. Methods now are no longer proper. As far as ahistorical universal truth, postmodernism says it's only when it's agreed upon. only when these things are agreed upon socially. When a society agrees upon these things, then they become a quote-unquote truth, but not until then. And even philosophical naturalism, you would think maybe that one would stick around, but it's too tied to the old ways of thinking and too tied to scientific process and all that. And so what we see instead in postmodernism was a rise in spirituality. Now, what we say is spiritual and what the world says is spiritual are two very different things, okay? And so, a postmodern would say, like, oh, you go to church, you receive some sort of benefit from going and singing and reading this book, and that's great. I'm happy for you. I'm glad that those things, help you. What helps me is holding these crystals and feeling the certain vibrations that certain crystals have, and feeling those things affect my spirit and affect my day and affect my mood, and that's what helps me. This church thing helps you. These crystals help me. None are better than the other. None are worse than the other. They're all the same. It's whatever you like, whatever I like, whatever. That's what postmodernism says. And so there is no such thing as truth. Okay? Now, sociological and culturally, these things kind of changed in recognizing those different cultures that people grew up in have a certain way of thinking. And they could predict and look at and analyze cultures and the way they think about certain things and the way they interact with understanding and growing in knowledge. And so, but because each culture, each society thinks certain ways, and each one is different, then each one must be either equally invalid or equally valid. And so that's kind of where it popped up in sociology and cultural studies. Okay? And so if you were to go to university today, you still might hear this term. There's the hard sciences and the soft sciences. Is that still something happening in schools? So a hard science would be math. Mathematicians look at postmodernism and go, no. 2 + 2 is still 4 in Japan, in another galaxy, here on, wherever you are, there is still a historical universal truth. So these things didn't gain ground everywhere, okay, in every place. But the soft sciences, like psychology, humanities, sociology, ethics, it's all debatable. There's no truth when it comes to those things. So those are the soft sciences. Those are the ones where we can determine those truths for ourselves. And so I actually heard of someone who said, and I think it was someone who called themselves a Christian, they said, we can't call something evil ever. And they asked him about 9/11. And he says, well, from our perspective, it might seem bad. But from the people, those terrorists flying the plane, he didn't use the term terrorists, those people flying the plane, for them it was good. So we can't call even that evil. You see where this leads? Everything's subjective, everything's debatable, and there's now nothing like good and evil as intrinsic ideas, intrinsic truths. Those things no longer exist under postmodernism. It is now just what is good for you or bad for you, right? Or what's good for me or bad for me. And we have to take all those perspectives into account. You have to, okay? Remember Star Trek? Right? So the original Star Trek series, so I'm not quite that old. I don't remember them, but what's the tagline, right? To boldly go where no man has gone before. Very sexist and problematic, right? That here, the Star Trek Enterprise is going to go out and learn about new cultures and learn about new planets and go on these exploration missions and kind of take over the universe on the behalf of the Federation, right? When you get to some of the later seasons, or not seasons, but later series of Star Trek, right? And instead, it's like They're learning about cultures, but then they're saying, well, that's right in that culture. We might think that's strange, but that's right for that. TV shows, movies, everything changes culturally when you change the way people think. Okay? These things don't come from nowhere. There's people who sit and think and teach and write books and influence societies in those ways. And I just showed you 3 different ways, 3 different places where postmodernism showed up and changed people's thinking. Okay? Thoughts or questions at this point?
I definitely see, at least in postmodernism as it is today, the linguistics of it, how those who think that they have this superior knowledge or their own knowledge, that we have to adopt their terms, their word terms.
Right.
We have, that's a part of it.
Yeah.
I also see that it was under, when you said liberal, is that they believe they have sort of a superior knowledge.
Right.
Which is what we call today an elite. You
Yeah.
hear a lot about the elite.
Yep, sure.
And we're just poor, peasants, dumb old Bible-believing
Sure.
peasants in the middle of the country. So I see a lot of applications to today. And I
Yeah.
also understand why we don't get along. They're so divisive.
Yeah,
We're not in a hermeneutical circle.
yeah,
We're on 2 ends
Yeah.
of postmodernism, right?
yeah, sure. The funny thing is practically, the postmodernisms don't actually practice what they preach even. So a postmodernist thinker, write a book on it, okay? Someone comes along and writes a review on that book. Not once and very often the author is able to respond to those reviews, and never once, not once, did that author go, well, that's just that person's perspective of what I wrote. I can't fault them for that. I wrote my things. I thought that was my perspective. They wrote what they thought I was writing. Not once. Every time a reviewer reviewed a book and then the author was able to respond to that reviewer, he went, that's not what I meant at all. I meant this, this, and this. He totally misunderstood. He's misrepresenting what I said. And so even though they say that there's no truth, there's no ahistorical, universal truths, they're still living and functioning as though those things are achievable, as those things are possible, them being misunderstood is still something bad, right? And yet, philosophically, postmodernists would say it's just the way it is. You got your perspective, I've got my perspective. There is no truth. There is no knowledge. There's not. It's just everything's perspectival. Okay. Other thoughts or questions?
As far as a tree, even with like our language, there's still like the truth that the tree exists, or that you can describe a tree.
Yeah.
So why does like having the language component in there change that?
Right, and that's because language is redefinable. And so, but you can't take things from one area of study and necessarily apply them to every area. And that's where postmodernists, I think, mess up with linguistics. Now, we spell tree a different way than other languages do. That is socially recognized and socially different, and just the way different cultures and societies have done that. But that doesn't mean that applies to all truth.
It seems like a bad starting point, because language is just a tool.
Sure.
Like you could take a picture of a tree and send it over the computer, and
Right.
the computer didn't cause the tree to be a tree.
Right. And that's where we can gain some ground back with this is, practically speaking, postmodernism doesn't really hold enough weight. There's some aspects that are true to it, okay? And yet, practically, you can convey some idea to another person, and they can understand what you're meaning, what you're saying, to a degree, right? That is achievable and possible. And yet, that's something that postmodernists would say isn't possible at all. Yeah, you could say the word tree, and the other person might think of a blueberry muffin. You have no idea, because that's postmodernism, right? And so It's purity. That's what postmodernism would say. That you could say something and they won't understand what you mean at all. One author actually used All in the Family as an example, the Archie Bunker. So there's a scene in Archie Bunker where he's sitting in his easy chair drinking a beer, and what's his wife's name? Edith, I think. Edith comes in with Archie Bunker's bowling shoes, because Archie wouldn't be caught dead polishing his own bowling shoes. Edith is polishing them, and she says, "Archie, do you want me to lace your shoes up or down?" And Archie goes, "Oh, what's the difference?" And she starts explaining the difference. Well, when you lace them up, you bring the laces up, and then you bring them down across. But if you lace them down, you go down with the laces, and then you come back up. And everybody, the laugh track is going on the episode, right? And this postmodernist author says, you see, he says one thing, she thinks another. That's true everywhere. But what does he not understand? The author of that book. The joke is everybody knows what Archie meant. Everybody knows Archie meant, who cares? Who cares whether they're laced up or down? I don't care. Everybody knew that except Edith. That's the joke. But here, this postmodernism thinker apparently was like Edith. He didn't understand the joke either. And so he said, see, this is just an example of postmodernistic thought. That he has his truth and his understanding. She has hers. And so real communication can actually happen as he's writing these things in a book for people to read and understand, right? And so again, practically it doesn't follow through. Other thoughts or questions? All right, so there's a number of what are called correlatives that go along with postmodernism. And by correlatives, I mean they correlate. So it's not necessarily cause and effect, but for whatever reason, these things all grew alongside with postmodernistic thought. And they were encouraged by postmodernism, and they also encouraged the postmodernism. So that's how they correlate with each other. I thought I wrote them down, but I guess I didn't. So the first one, huge rise in biblical illiteracy. Along with postmodernism, we saw a huge rise in biblical illiteracy. When I was teaching after-school students, I had to start with, I'd have to print off pages from the Bible, and I had to explain to them what the big numbers and little numbers meant. They'd never had any experience with the Bible at all. That there's two testaments, what the word testament means, just no understanding. If they thought of Moses at all, he was a cartoon character. And even today, you speak to some people and they might think Charlton Heston. I mean, very, very biblical illiterate culture that has gone alongside of postmodernism. Okay, people just don't know anything of what the Bible says. Second is an increase in secularism. Now there's even more reason to keep religion at bay, to keep it off to the side, to keep it at the periphery. And so if there's no ahistorical universal truth, then that means whatever you think about God, that's okay. Whatever I think about God, that's okay too. No one can say you're wrong or you're right. Those don't exist under postmodernism. So secularism now becomes something strictly on the peripheral of life or non-existent altogether. An increase in New Age theosophy. A worldview and a way of seeing life in a New Age way. And so again, that's that spirituality that can mean whatever you want it to mean. Spirituality that wherever you find it, wherever you get it, we've actually seen an increase in belief in witchcraft. It's not something that is silly or a joke anymore. It's people actually buying into this stuff and saying, this is who we are. I'm a witch, and that has increased under postmodernism. Fourth, a growth in pragmatism. Pragmatism is the idea of give the people what they want. okay? And once upon a time, the people wanted shorter sermons, more entertaining services, better music, and so that's what the churches did. And they got people in the church. And this was big amongst the boomer and the post-boomer generations, okay? Give the people what they want. Now what do people want? They want whatever they want. And we have to cater to that. And so if you want people in your church, you have to be really fluid with what you teach and what you say and what you require of people, right? So who wants to be a member of our church? Just raise your hand. Okay, you desire it. That's all that matters. It is your own desire. That's all that matters. We don't hold anybody to a standard. We don't say this is right or wrong. Well, we can't say any of those things. Your desire is the only thing now that counts. That's what pragmatism gets at, is figuring out what works and giving the people what they want. A huge rise in individualism. Now it's not necessarily what's good for a society, or good for a culture, good for our community. It's what I want. It's what's good for me. That's all I care about. What am I going to get? What am I after? And what is good for me? So that's individualism. And then we see, as a result as well, a therapeutic culture. Even in my college and seminary, we had probably twice as many people studying to be counselors as there were young men studying to be pastors. Just not as many people interested in it. And so the idea of therapy and having a therapy, and so I'm not saying that what some of the things they say are wrong. I'm not saying that at all. But we've seen a huge rise in this therapeutic culture, even a Freudian kind of impulse. But now that becomes us being able to express ourselves, someone listening to us, and then very often not making any kind of determination about what those things are or whether they're right or wrong. Just me being able to express myself. Okay, it can be very therapeutic, right? Speaking my truth, getting my voice out there, being heard. And so I'm sure many of you are able to apply these things to even what's happening today in our culture. If you've heard the word platform, it's a result of some of this therapeutic type culture. If you say what you believe a lot and a lot of people want to listen to what you have to say, what you think, now you've achieved a platform, right? And so again, there's all different areas where this is influenced culture. Okay, thoughts or questions on the correlatives? When it comes to postmodernism, does anybody see any strengths? Anything that's they consider good from?
Well, I think it might level out legalism a little bit.
Explain. How do you mean?
Well, legalism is do this and do that, and it's rigid, and if you don't do this, where correlative thinking says, you know what, you don't have to wear a bow tie and suspenders to be sick, right?
What? I got it wrong this whole time. Yeah, good, yeah, yep. I think postmodernism has some strengths. Okay, the recognition that there are presuppositions out there, different viewpoints, different perspectives. Knowing that I don't read the Bible the same way a Japanese woman in the year 1200, knowing that is real, that's true, and trying to think through like, well, how could culturally someone say those? And so again, go to Thailand and go out to a Buddhist temple and learn in Thai the words, Jesus is Lord. You know what those Buddhists just heard? Jesus is less important than Gautama the Buddha. Because to reach nirvana, to reach bliss, to reach the final stage of your existence means nothing else can be predicated of you. Nothing else can be said about you. You're neither good, bad, cold, hot. You're nothing. You're nothing anymore. That's the achievement in Buddhism. And so to say Jesus is Lord, well, you just predicated something about him. You just said something about him. Therefore, Jesus must be inferior to Buddha. Well, that's not what the Christian is trying to say, right? And so again, to recognize there are these presuppositions, there's this different way of thinking, different kinds of thought, culturally, sociologically, linguistically, right? So go to Thailand Buddha and just tell people in English. They're just going to think you're some crazy white English person, right? American, right? And so even linguistically, those things matter. Other thoughts, strengths that you see.
I don't know if it always works this way, but they propose to care about the individual and what they feel and their experience.
Yeah, it does take those things into account. I think you're right. I think that is a strength to a degree, and so absolutely, it's no longer this is the truth. Take it or leave it. You don't like it. There's the door. Meeting people where they're at, understanding grace, and what a compassionate relationship with people looks like. Again, I think it goes along with that, the cutting out the legalism of this is what people look like here. And if you don't fit this mold, well, then there's the door,
I think
yeah.
for me, coming from Faith Church, where biblical counseling was the foundation, because people are hurting, people do need someone to listen to them. So a return to biblical counseling, not man's way, secular
Right.
counseling, Freudian.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, maybe?
Yeah. Yep. And so for Christians, that we see that as important, and so that's kind of combining some things, but it does take some of those strengths from postmodernism of being able to listen to different viewpoints, listen to different perspectives, realize that people are coming from different places in life, different backgrounds, different tragedies that have occurred in their life. It's more likely to take those things into account. I think that's right. Yeah. In some ways, I think it doesn't go far enough. So postmodernism focused on the finite knower, me. And I think that's right. I think it was good that they recognize, like, wait a minute, I'm saying I'm the arbiter of truth, the understanding of all knowledge, but I'm finite. What would Christianity say even stronger than that? I'm fallen. I'm fallen, yeah. I am completely unreliable. That's what Christianity says. It's like, I am fallen. I am not able to understand certain things and really all things. The heart is desperately wicked, right? That's what Christianity teaches. And so I think postmodernism is right in recognizing the finite nature to the human mind and human understanding of truth, but it just doesn't go far enough in that direction. And so I see some of these, as strengths of postmodernism. Other thoughts? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about an analysis, maybe, and even a response. Okay, so first, I think we can recognize that real communication is possible. Okay, I mentioned this earlier. You can describe a tree to somebody, and they can understand what you're saying. And so practically speaking, postmodernist assessment that no communication is actually really possible because everybody has their own perspective and everybody is finite. Well, that just doesn't really hold water in the end. And so, and even those certain authors who had an intention for their books is real. So it's called authorial intent. When you write something down, you have an intended meaning in that writing, right? Whether it's essay, a book, whatever you're writing, a blog, you're writing something, you're intending someone to understand what you mean. They might misunderstand that, but that does not negate the fact that you had an intended meaning behind those written words. What does that mean when it comes to understanding the Bible?
There is
There's intent behind it. There's an authorial intent. And therefore, to understand the Bible well, we rightly understand the culture in which it was written. We rightly look at the language in which it was written. And we also remember that ultimately it is a supernatural book authored by God himself. And so to recognize those things is absolutely appropriate for us as Christians. We cannot buy into this, that there's no intent from the author or no understandable or discernible intent that we can pick up on. And so postmodernism does not get that right in any sense. There's this thesis that seems to be found in postmodernism, which is completely untenable. Okay, it's and that is this. Okay, the thesis is you must know something exhaustively, perfectly, or completely, or you can't understand any of it at all. That seems to be the antithesis formed in postmodernism. That you either have to, because you're finite, you can't know something perfectly, and therefore, because you don't have perfect knowledge, you can't know anything. That's the claim of postmodernism. That's just not true. That's just not true. We can know things in degrees, right? And I've used this example before, right? So if I sang at home, Jesus loves me, this I know, Matthew can finish that, for the Bible tells me so, right? My 2-year-old. He knows Jesus loves me. But if I were to sit down and say, Matthew, how do you know that Jesus loves you? How do you know? He would probably just go, I don't know. The Bible tells me so. Well, where in the Bible? He would know that. Let's ask one of my older kids, right? Where in the Bible? Well, one of my older kids might go, well, John 3:16 says that for God so loved the world, and I'm part of the world, so that must mean God loves me, right? Well, child of mine, do you know that very often in the Gospel of John, when it talks about world, it talks about the moral rebellious nature of the world? What do you really know about John's Gospel anyway? Or, do you know the context of that verse and how that applies? Do you know all these things? Well, probably not, right? But let's say that child goes on and goes to Bible college and goes to seminary and goes to postgraduate studies and earns a PhD in Johannine studies and the nature of love within the context of Johannine linguistics and theological understanding, right? Now all of a sudden he's writing doctoral level things on the love of God in the Gospel of John and how God loves me, but from a doctoral, will we say he knows more than he did when he was 2? Yeah, I think we can safely say that. Postmodernism throws all that out. You either can know something perfectly and exhaustively, or you can't know it at all. Okay, and it comes back to, and I used this before, if here's me at age 0, and here's 100 years later, so this is time, and this is knowledge, and as I go down, I get closer and closer to perfect knowledge. I never get close to it. I just get closer to it. Math is called an asymptote. For you awesome people who know math like I do, right? It's asymptotal. So instead of the hermeneutical circle, taking some of these things into account, what we see instead is a hermeneutical spiral. Okay, and so there are things that you're different, you read the text different, when you come back to it, you read the text different, but you grow in these things, and you get closer and closer and closer to the truth, even though you don't fully and finally achieve it and get to it. So I'm going to cut us off here. There's a number of other things we can think about and talk about when it comes to this, and a variety of different examples we can look at from society and as far as how this has impacted the culture and world around us at large. And so we'll talk about some of those things next week as well. But I'm going to leave it at that, and I'm going to pray, and we'll be